Took the train down to Brighton. This room's too hot to sleep. Hardwood hidden under carpet. Young love howling in the street. And those rainy days in London felt like the rain inside of me. Now I've been carrying around this baggage for too long. Think I'll leave it by the sea. I'll leave it by the sea, with the ruins of my past and worry whisper. Leave it by the sea, with the things that I've done wrong and you got used to. 'Cause I was an anchor in my old life, rusted me. I lived my life upon the shore. I never touched the sea, but I knew I was an anchor. Yes, I believe I was an anchor. So leave me by the sea, with the ruins of my past and worried whisper. Leave me by the sea, with the things that I've done wrong and you got used to. 'Cause I'm an anchor now. Keep me or throw me out. Leave me by the sea. Now I've never been so lost, no, no. 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 I've never been so lost. Leave me by the sea. Oh, leave me by the sea. Leave me by the sea. Took the train down to Brighton. This room's too hot to sleep. Hardwood hidden under carpet. Young love howling in the street. And those rainy days in London felt like the rain inside of me. Now I've been carrying around this baggage for too long. Think I'll leave it by the sea. I'll leave it by the sea, with the ruins of my past and worry whisper. Leave it by the sea, with the things that I've done wrong and you got used to. 'Cause I was an anchor in my old life, rusted me. I lived my life upon the shore. I never touched the sea, but I knew I was an anchor. Yes, I believe I was an anchor. So leave me by the sea, with the ruins of my past and worried whisper. Leave me by the sea, with the things that I've done wrong and you got used to. 'Cause I'm an anchor now. Keep me or throw me out. Leave me by the sea. Now I've never been so lost, no, no. 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 I've never been.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar space. The Say Their Name scrolling presentation was put together by us earlier this week. It's not complete and will remain a work in progress. The names scrolled on the screen are the names of persons killed or seriously injured due to the use of excessive force by police services in Canada, and the names of incarcerated persons also that died by the use of excessive force or criminal negligence in prisons and jails throughout this country. Kimberly Crenshaw, co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum, believes that we say their names because if we can say their names, we can know more about their stories, broaden our knowledge. I agree. Say Their Names is intended as a demonstration of respect for those who have been forever silenced. It is in large part why we are gathered here today. It is the tragic impact of a punitive criminal justice system in Canada. The song played during Say Their Names is called Leave It by the Sea, written and performed by William Prince, an Indigenous and Juno Award-winning artist from Peguis First Nation in Manitoba. The song is from his Reliever album, released in February 2020, and was recorded in Winnipeg. William Prince is aware and pleased that we are using his song with our presentation, and he wishes everyone here a good evening and wishes us luck with our presentation. We are located on the traditional territory of the Wendat, Petun Nation, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This land has been the site of human activity for over 15,000 years and is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, a sacred treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg. The people online with us are from all across Turtle Island, and we acknowledge and respect the people of this land. My name's Nancy Russell, and I'm the program coordinator of the Criminal Justice Program at the Canadian Friends Service Committee, or CFSC for short. CFSC, founded in 1931, acts on the peace and social justice concerns of Quakers in Canada. CFSC seeks to alleviate suffering and works to develop transformative and sustainable approaches to human rights, justice, and peace. We act through practical assistance, research, education, and policy dialogues. CFSC is a federally registered charitable organization since 1967 and also a not-for-profit corporation. Now, a little bit about Quakers. Canadian Quakers believe in penal abolition, and that means in part that justice must be compassionate and focus on how to heal rather than on how to punish. In 1981, Canadian Quakers became the first religious body to call for the abolition of prison. This took place at their Canadian yearly meeting and is recorded as Minute 93. I'd like to read you a part of that. The prison system is both a cause and a result of violence and social injustice. Throughout history, The majority of prisoners have been powerless and oppressed. We are increasingly clear that the imprisonment of human beings, like their enslavement, is inherently immoral and is as destructive to the cagers as to the caged. A Quaker Minute, by the way, is the record of a shared decision of a meeting for business as written by the clerk, recording clerk, or the convener of that meeting. There are many famous Quakers you may have heard about. The Elizabeth Fry Society takes its name from a Quaker who was a world-renowned humanitarian and prison reformer in England during the late 1700s. Here's an insightful quote by Ms. Fry. "Does capital punishment tend to the security of the people? By no means. It hardens the hearts of men and makes the loss of life appear light to them, and it renders life insecure, inasmuch as the law holds out that property is of greater value than life." That was said over 200 years ago and is ever so true today. Other famous Quakers, Joan Baez, Ursula Franklin, who was a physicist, author, and educator, Ben Kingsley, Bayard Rustin, a Black American civil rights leader who worked with Martin Luther King, Dorothy Stowe, a Canadian-born co-founder of Greenpeace, James Dean, Dame Judi Dench, and Richard Nixon, which surprised me, Bonnie Raitt, and Kevin Bacon, to name a few. So tonight is the first of a series of 3 webinars that are actually phase 2 of The Only Way Forward, which is an initiative of CFSC. Phase 1 of The Only Way Forward began in mid-September and consisted of a 30-day Do the Work calendar and companion Facebook page. The calendar phase of the project blended opportunities for exploration and self-reflection with discussions, feedback, and occasional film screenings. The focus was on the justice system, colonialism, systemic racism, its impacts, alternatives, and next steps. We've been working with an advisory group of consultants since the early summer, and they have been instrumental in guiding the Only Way Forward project. 2 of our committee members are here this evening as speakers on the panel. So let me get to introducing the speakers tonight. First, we're very lucky and thankful to have Yasmin Ibrahim with us tonight. Yasmin is a child and youth care practitioner and currently working on her Bachelor of Arts degree in the Child and Youth Care program at Humber College. She is passionate about her work with youth and about penal abolition. Yasmin was actually a student of mine at Humber, and her peer leadership skills were so immediately evident, she ended up as my co-facilitator for 2 semesters. Yasmin is a member of the Only Way Forward advisory group and has been working with the project since early in the summer. Ozawa Anunkwe, Yellow Star Woman, also known as Teddy Syrette, has a background in social justice for First Nations, Two-Spirit, and LGBTQ plus communities. With experience in theater, social work, and justice, Teddy also comes with many years of experience as a trainer and public speaker. They have won many awards, among them the Sault Ste. Marie YMCA Peace Medal. I worked on a project with Teddy many years ago at the Provincial Advocate's office and still remember the photo of them with then Premier Kathleen Wynne, rainbow feather boas draped around each other at the World Pride Human Rights Conference in Toronto. It's a really wonderful memory. Teddy's also a member of our advisory group. Very honored to have Teddy speak to us tonight. And last but not least is Orville Wallace. In 2008, Orville received the YMCA Peace Medallion for his work as the founder and chair of the Youth Justice Network of Toronto. This network continues to grow and has become a vital communication hub for over 800 youth justice stakeholders across the GTA. I met Orville many years ago when I was working at Central Toronto Youth Services and was struck by his ability as a convener, collaborative leader, and inspirational speaker. Orville currently serves as the Director of Programs and Strategic Initiatives at the Laidlaw Foundation. We are delighted to welcome Orville Wallace as our first speaker this evening.
Thanks, Nancy. Let me just get Orville's presentation started. always encompass the lived realities of many Black and Indigenous peoples within within their social location, as well as the racial trauma endured through systemic racism, which makes it much harder to achieve success for them. So that's one thing I wanted to mention in terms of meritocracy. Okay, so we'll move on. Sorry. The impacts for youth in a punitive justice system, and we wanted to now get into the topic of basically what are the impacts for youth in this justice system that's very punitive. And what the data is showing is that there's a lot of trauma, there's racial trauma. You're seeing mental health crises, mental health issues with specifically when you disaggregate the data, you'll see it's been magnified and exasperated through COVID and through the current realities that we're living through. A lack of hope you're seeing with many youth, even adults that are in this system, lack of acknowledgement of the systemic racism that exists. So that's a huge problem in terms of, wanting to advance change. There's this lack of acknowledgement of the systemic racism. Then there's a lack of future employment opportunities. So you have individuals now with a adult record or a youth record, and oftentimes you're finding employers that are not going to give them opportunities, so they're stuck and they're getting into this cycle of recidivism where they're not getting access to really get income to live an honest life. Then you're also seeing low literacy skills, access to education. So there's not enough literacy programs. So many of the youth that I've worked with, and even adults, are not even having the literacy skills to even understand what their charges mean, how to navigate and how to communicate effectively, and what to say, what words to use. There's just a lack of low literacy skills. The stress related illnesses, so that's a huge piece as well. So we're seeing that leading to high blood pressure, higher areas of heart disease. It's now we've seen how anti-Black racism has been declared by health officials in Ontario as a public health crisis. So it's a huge issue. High rates of obesity, and we're seeing many youth and adults, and they're in prison for a while. There isn't proper health care that's given to them, so they come out with higher levels of obesity, and that's these are some of the major factors that I've documented here. Then I'm gonna bring it home now. I'm gonna talk about to the next slide, my lived experience and how that's kind of fits into this discussion. So I experienced growing up, and I think it's really important. Growing up, I experienced racism in the school system, with my peers on an individual basis within day-to-day interactions, and by experiencing off-color jokes. I knew personally from a young age that the struggle that Black youth and adults faced from conversations that I had many years ago with my parents, constantly telling me that I needed to work twice as hard as my non-Black peers in order to move forward in life. Now that I'm older, I realize how much systems of oppression that involves institution structures, norms, to name a few, are embedded within the fabric of society. For example, I'll give you an example. I recall many times as a Black youth worker working in a community, Jane and Finch. It was a highly racialized, low-income community in Toronto, and being harassed by the police and being asked for my identification while on my way to the store to simply buy lunch, because I, quote unquote, fit the description. So it's during these times that I know I must comply with the police and show no pushback, for the simple fact that as a Black man in a situation like this, the outcome for me could potentially result in death. You see, these are the realities that Black people and Black youth face on a daily basis due to the prevalence of implicit unconscious bias and symptoms of oppression that are discriminatory and inherently embedded within the fabric of society and reinforced through structural racism. For example, when we talked about the history, it provides the basis for white supremacy or culture providing the normalization and replication of racism. This is, I mean, definitely a huge factor, and will definitely, we see the impact of racial trauma and what it does. But once you firsthand experience it, then you have a different understanding of it. You see, you see, although COVID-19 right now is our current adversary, we see the protesters are marching because of the issue of anti-Black racism being a plague, for which no known vaccine has been developed and has killed many of the hearts, minds, and bodies of Black people navigating the justice system and many other systems for centuries. And it's something to know that, we this is something that many racialized, indigenous, Black people have been going through, not just over the last 6 months since the incident with George Floyd, but it's been going on for many centuries. So this racism is like, it's like a social cancer. It needs to be removed from the culture within the justice system. It needs to be treated and definitely addressed. However, we still, although we experience it, we know that there's no known vaccine for it. Um, the reason, so what happened with George Floyd in May, and why that, resonated with a generation of Black people, is because they realized, and we realized, we could have met the same fate. And then that's kind of what I'm trying to bring to light here. So that's just a little bit of shaping in terms of my experience. Right now I play the role of navigating a network within the city of Toronto, a huge network, but I also I work heavily in philanthropy. I provide opportunities to grassroots organizations, and seeing the challenges and how COVID has really shed a light in these many low income communities, and the overrepresentation of COVID is really, really disheartening, seeing the inequities that exist between low income, racialized, and Black Indigenous communities. So I'll move on to the next slide. So our current situation with youth in the justice system. So what we're seeing now is, first, we have to acknowledge that systemic racism is real. It contributes to the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous youth in the prison system. It also comes down to, when you think about youth in the justice system specifically, um, it comes down to choices. However, it comes down to the other issues such as over policing. We're seeing poverty, lack of access. Once a youth enters the system at a young age, or feels lost or hopeless, they often feel like they don't have a choice. It's like any other crime. It's a choice, but what leads someone to feeling that they have to make that choice is what's important. For example, hunger may lead to theft. Poverty may lead to drugs or human trafficking. It's what leads to that is where we really need to break it down and address that core issue there. Then you're looking at money as a motivator for young people, and why that's important, and that's related to poverty. So we need programs for youth, those already in and outside of the justice system, that will provide them with the skills which can lead to financial independence, entrepreneurship, wealth being. There's a saying that says, the Shaq is rich, but the person who signs Shaq's check is wealthy. And we want to get youth to have that mindset of generational wealth, and breaking down barriers to get to obtaining that. Also, our community needs to teach our kids values, morals, and nurture them with love from a young age. You see, too many kids are left to their own device. They're working, where they're in single parent homes. These are many times low income communities where a mom is working maybe 2-3 jobs, and you have an older sibling who's a latchkey kid having to take care of 3 other younger siblings, in some cases living in a 2-bedroom apartment. And this is the realities that we're seeing. And so kids are left to their own device, and it leads to getting involved in situations that are not able, they're not able to manage and re, and get into and be able to solve on their own without the support of a caring adult. So I wanted to then move into the topic of policing in the next slide, and we can move to the next slide. So this is one of the things you're seeing, you're hearing in the news a lot, and you're seeing the correlation between youth policing, the senseless murders, and the pandemic. And this question's coming up in the media and social media, on the news, and it's about defunding the police. So should we defund the police? So, and this question, for me, like, I mean, this question, definitely draws merit to a conversation given the current context and history of police brutality. So I think, personally, I think we need to detask the police. And what that means is there are many tasks that I see that the police don't even like doing. For example, mental health calls, landlord issues, and many other personalized issues, and that are affecting people from a mental health perspective. Um, and these and other calls could potentially be directed to another source that can work with such people in a more anti-oppressive way. So this is one way to really look at that question in terms of taking some tasks away. Ultimately, could mean defunding them, but ultimately it's looking at detasking them from some tasks, letting them focus on safety and other crime, serious crime related issues. So defunding has been going on for many years in other sectors, but outcomes haven't actually been any better. So leaders now need to address, and why I started out by talking about legacies and meritocracy is because the root of it is around acknowledging the history of colonialism, the over policing of Black and Indigenous people, and better police oversight. So there's some definitely structural, institutional issues that exist that need to change within the policing system that contribute to the punitive justice system that we're talking about today, and many of these impacts. So I wanted to move forward to the next slide, which is final thoughts. And here we are, the impacts of a punitive justice system. And so the impacts of a punitive justice system has a huge impact on those experiencing disparities within the justice system. So that's one of the themes I mentioned earlier, was breaking down, getting into the disaggregated data and looking at who are furthest away, who are the people that are most overrepresented, underserved in the justice sector, and what are their identities and cultures. And the data doesn't lie. It's specifically, there's an overrepresentation of Indigenous and Black youth. The justice system needs huge reform. A justice system that oppresses Black Indigenous people is not a problem for Black and Indigenous people to fix. It's for the gatekeepers of the system. And that's something really, really important to note, that, the system can't, the people, it just can't fix itself without the gatekeepers involved and decision makers being involved in taking accountability. The time is now to break this vicious cycle of recidivism. We're in a pandemic that has shown that has exacerbated some of the experiences of Indigenous and Black youth, and unfortunately, you're seeing senseless killings that have been magnified. Right now, we have technology. So what's different from back in the 60s and 70s is that there wasn't as much technology. What happened in 1992 with Rodney King was, it just happened to be a person on the balcony with a video camera taping that incident, and it led to a whole uphaul in across North America. What you're seeing today is a pandemic that has allowed people to stay home and further magnify some of the daily realities of Black, Indigenous, and racialized people. So I'll leave it at that. Those are my final thoughts. And if there's any questions, that was just the last of the session, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And I'm definitely happy to be here. Thanks again, Nancy, for the invite. I'm looking forward to the other presentations.
Thanks, Orville. We'll have the questions come to you when everyone has done, if that's okay.
Perfect.
Is that okay? Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Orville, for your presentation. It was really good. Recidivism. Never heard that word before. It's a good word for me to learn and take back. So thank you so much for your teachings today. Ani bojo, ojawana kwe nadishnakas, my gun nadodam, obajwana donjaba. My name, my Anishinaabe name, my something else name is Yellow Star Ojawanang, and I am Anishinaabe from Batchewana First Nation. I grew up on Rankin Reserve, and I currently live in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. My background, as Nancy had mentioned, is in social work, theater, and bingo. So my conversation style and presentation style is a little bit more fluid. My dear friend Nancy asked me to come and ask to be a presenter on this panel for you this evening to talk about criminal justice youth in an Indigenous lens. So my background is in social work in Native specialization. So I graduated from Sault College in that program roughly about 10 years ago. And I do advocacy for Two-Spirit, or LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, plus Indigenous communities and voices. So I identify as being Two-Spirit. My pronouns are they and them. And for other purposes, people also know me as Teddy. So how I usually do my workshops, because what I like to do is I like to know who is in the room when I walk into a space, and usually I usually don't want to when it comes to titles aren't really important to me. I just want to know who's in the room and who is presenting what kind of information, or what do they know or what do they don't know when it comes to being Indigenous and being LGBTQ. And a lot of times there's it's a space that opens up for people to have conversations about what they know or what they think they know about being First Nation and Indigenous. And a lot of times there's different concepts and histories that pop up when it comes to policing of Indigenous people throughout history in Turtle Island, when it comes to the aspect of colonization. And usually how I usually do it is I use a word cloud platform. So you'll usually use a word cloud, and people go in a circle, or they just share what they know or what they think they know about being First Nations. And then there's usually a story that comes from that, or we can tie that information together as we go along. And I think historically, no matter what your interests are, whether it's art, whether it's academia, whether it's business, whether it's in sports and recreation, there's ways of Indigenous lived experiences that also contribute to what does Indigenous business look like? What does Indigenous trade look like? What does Indigenous holistic care look like when it comes to taking care of that community? And I think that's why I got into social work with a specific lens of Indigenous specialization, because it did not only just teach us the theory and the practicum of social work, but also taught us how to treat community from a holistic lens, using aspects of the medicine wheel, the great-grandfather teachings, which are an Anishinaabe value system here in my territory. But that can be, when it talks about all aspects of someone's individuality, and all aspects of life. So I think when it comes down to providing care for people in our communities, if we're helpers as social workers, as educators, as nurses, or police officers, we have to understand that those histories can be very complex depending on what our identities are. So if we identify as being Brown, if we identify as being Indigenous, if we identify as being gay or transgender, all those aspects of our identity is going to impact ourselves, how we get access to education, how do we get access to employment, and we have to look at historically of how some of those systems got put into place, because the education system here in Canada was not necessarily made for Indigenous people. We had a separate education system called residential school for Indigenous people, and those imposed education systems look very different for Indigenous people today compared to what they first did, like when early colonizers or early settlers first came to these lands and first started meeting Indigenous people, because some of those first identities when it comes to schools were Jesuit priests opening up schools with close in First Nations communities or really close by First Nations communities, and trying to get in those communities, First Nations communities, to indoctrinate and be a part of that community and be a part of that process. So, and then we start seeing those early signs of assimilation processes happening at the very beginning of contact during colonization. You had different relationships that are very different for Indigenous people. Some of them could have been very peaceful. Other times that peace looked very different afterwards, depending on who was at those treaty signings. If people were invited to different treaty signings, because there are Indigenous people out there today who have treaty rights. So I myself have First Nations treaty rights. I have status rights. I have a status card, if you can say. It's in my wallet right now. It's funny, it does expire in a couple of years. So, but even though the card expires, I'm still Indigenous. So just keep that in mind. And not every Indigenous person or not every First Nations person has a status card, because not every First Nations signed a treaty to negotiate what those treaty rights could be. Some people were left out of those conversations for different reasons. Sometimes people missed out on signing those treaties, maybe due to weather, when trying to access to sign those agreements to those gatherings. And for like with my community here in Batchewana First Nation, so we have like the Williams Treaty, and because we're right on the south end of Lake Superior. So there's Indigenous communities here that are Ojibwe, First Nation, I guess you can say, here in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. On Michigan side, right across the border, there's like Chippewa and Ojibwe people on that side. And at the time when we had those borders being put in place in Canada, when the United States was like, okay, we're the United States and we're Canada, they would go to First Nations communities and tell them like, okay, so you have to choose a side. If you're going to choose on this side, you'll be American, and then you'll have access to these rights. If you choose this side, then you're Canadian and you get access to these rights. When you had different waterways and communities sharing different waterways, and now we're split on a border, an imaginary border, an imposed border, it had a very hard impact on those communities when they shared sides. So because they never had a border there to begin with. So now they had to make that decision. So even today, there are relations on this side of the border who might not know those relations on that side of the border. And the border that is imaginary, that's been made up. But when you come to like the policing of Indigenous people, it also gets advanced with the RCMP. So with like the Royal Canadian Mounted Police systems that got put in place to also help manage Indigenous peoples when it came to First Nations communities who were put on reserves. Reserve systems that were in place by the Indigenous Affairs system, or INAC, Indigenous Affairs Canada. And those First Nations people who were put onto those reservations were being monitored or surveyed by the Indian agents at that time, and who had to basically keep track on what was the movement of those Indigenous people. So even if we look at some of the modern advancements or modern movements today when it comes to Indigenous people, such as like I Don't Know More, the Wisconsin land movement in BC, the Mi'kmaq lobster fishery treaty events that are happening out in Nova Scotia. A lot of those events are happening because of what was signed in history before. And some of those treaty signings were even older than Canada itself. So how do those communities and how are those treaties being recognized today? But how are those imposed systems when it comes to education, when it comes to policing, when it comes to healthcare, are imposed onto Indigenous people today? Because what Indigenous people had before, they had access to sovereignty. They had their own ways to deal with crime and moments of injustice in those communities in their own way. And I think what happens now is that we have a lot of Indigenous communities who don't have access to maybe treaty rights, they don't have access to land, they don't have access to spiritual care, spiritual wellness. There are a lot of folks here in Canada right now who are not even aware that they are Indigenous because of that history of shame that gets imposed into different cultural communities. So, and for myself, to be an advocate for LGBTQ people, that those situations or those communities or conversations are even more complex when it starts talking about gender diversity and sexuality. So looking at an example like in Toronto and how the LGBTQ community in Toronto and their history with policing has been very negative in a lot of cases. So for instance, there was recently just like a Black trans woman who died in the police care in Toronto Police Services, and the community there wants answers. And there's been a high history of that. So even like in the previous cases of like Bruce McArthur and the serial killer that was stalking LGBTQ people, or specifically men in the Toronto area, there was already conversations of people talking about people going missing and that people are being targeted by other folks historically. And then after Bruce McArthur was even arrested, you had the police telling the community or telling the media that they weren't having a lot of community input, that that relationship wasn't there, or they weren't getting a lot of say, or that they really didn't know, which was really false, because people had already had those conversations or mentioning it of people being targeted within that community. And when it comes to historically here in Canada, is that Canada was not made for Indigenous people. It was not made for people of color. It was made for women. It wasn't made for LGBTQ people, because like historically, Indigenous people didn't get the right to vote until 1960. Here in Canada, it was still illegal to have to practice homosexuality, be open about your homosexuality until like 1969. So, and then here in Canada, where there's a large percentage of Indigenous people who has been incarcerated in the criminal justice system. And I think that has to deal with the lack of awareness, and it's a lack of history, because I traveled around to different communities asking people what they know and what they don't know about First Nations communities. 10 years ago, that conversation was very mute. It was a lot of me doing a lot of conversating, because a lot of people just didn't know, or a lot of things that people did know were a lot of the things that they just heard in the media that were very negative. That there was high rates of alcoholism in communities, high rates of suicide, that Indigenous communities, that there was high rates of violence, that there's murdered and missing Indigenous women. And people didn't understand why. And it's because and I think a lot of it has to do with education, because our education system doesn't teach us what it means to be Indigenous, or what it means to be, how Canada has impacted Indigenous people. Because I think for a lot of times when it comes to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the 94 calls to action, a lot of people just wanted, when those 94 calls to action were released, a lot of people wanted to know what the solution was. And automatically, instead of talking about the truth, they wanted to talk right about reconciliation. And it's like, okay, but what are we reconciling? Who are we reconciling? What are we reconciling, and who needs to do that reconciliation work? I think when it comes for Indigenous people, if they've been impacted by aspects of residential school, or if they've been impacted by the 60s or 70s scoop, or the modern scoop today, or if they've been impacted by the reservation system, that there's going to be multiple challenges if they haven't started unpacking what that colonial trauma or historical trauma could be. Because that's the one thing about intergenerational trauma, is that it gets passed down from generation to generation. And if the generation just doesn't stop and start healing and start unpacking what that history was, then that cycle can continue. So if you have a history of Indigenous children who are living in the care system, there's a high percentage of those children also going to be impacted by the criminal justice system if they don't have different support systems, if they don't have different services in place for them. And we're talking about services that are in place on reserve and services that are off reserve, because a large portion of Indigenous communities are living in urban centers because of the lack of accessibility or access of services or programming or education within their own communities. So there's a lot of work that needs to get done, and a lot of it comes down with awareness, and it comes down with allies, settlers, and colonizers to start unpacking what that history was themselves, and really investing within their own history and really understanding what that true history of Canada is. Because when it comes to being a proud Canadian, you can be a proud Canadian all you want, but I think as an Indigenous person, I would rather hear you say what you're specifically proud about, because when I hear someone's a proud Canadian, I hear that you're proud of genocide and that you're also proud of insulin, that you're proud of Roberta Bondar, and you're also proud of residential schools. So I really feel like when it comes down to talking about awareness, it really comes down to understanding what are your comfort levels are and how you can get over that uncomfortable levels if you're dealing with racism, if you're dealing with your own bias. Once you get over that, then I think more conversations can be had. And I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. All right. How's everyone? I hope everyone's good and staying safe. So I'm going to start my presentation now. I'm using my phone, so I'm going to be looking to my laptop. I apologize for that. So I would like to start my presentation by talking about the 3 stages in the justice system that I believe that are really important when correlating with race. So before entering the justice system, there are a lot of factors that happen to youth. And the first factor that I like to speak about is school education. So schools in Canada are funded by property tax, and based on the neighborhood that you live in, you might have a totally different education than someone that literally lives a couple of streets down from you, as a lot of parents are boosters in some of these schools and provide, more funding, provide uniforms to teams, provide a lot of other supports that a lower income school might not have. So they're already at an advantage than a racialized community that goes to a school that doesn't have all of that, and it's the same public school. It's just that the community they're in. And I think that's a very big, impactful thing that affects a lot of youth. I lived in an area where, the school was it was a mixed income area, and I went to both schools. I went to a school in a low income area and a high income area, and I seen the difference in terms of the amount of computers we had, the amount of special ed support that was provided, and it's very impactful to the youth's outcome in life. Also, I want to talk about what we have to teach our children before they even get involved in the youth justice system or any system. As a Black mother, Black father, you have to tell your son, hey, if the police pull you over, put your hands where they can see them. Make sure that you are very quiet. Talk to them with respect. Say yes, no, sir. Talk very politely. The most sudden movement that you make of your hand literally can end your life. And this is a conversation that Black parents have to have directly with their children. Black and Indigenous parents have to have with their children. And this is a conversation that, white parents usually don't have with their children. It's just a reality that more Black lives and Indigenous lives are ended by police. And because of this, before they even end up in the justice system, we have to have these conversations about the justice system to them personally. So in regards to my own personal experience, my first charge ever was at a retail store. I stole a CD. I was in a group home. I was bored. I didn't really have any guidance, and I stole a CD, and I was actually arrested, put in a holding cell overnight for a CD that was probably less than $20. The charge didn't go away. I had to go to court about 5 times for that charge. And because of that, I, lacked in my education. I had to find bus fare to get there. I didn't have bus fare. No one takes you to court. You have to find your way there. You don't show up to the court. You get a subpoena for your arrest right away. So it was very difficult for me. And it kind of spiraled down my life after that. And it was such a little charge. And the thing that a lot of people are not aware of is that the police have discretion, right? They can choose to let someone go for something very minor. And it seems in terms of a lot of people who are racialized, even the most minor charge, usually they are getting charged and going through the court system. When the police do have a little bit of discretion, they could have chose to just give me a warning. but I was arrested for that. So I just want to really talk about the discretion. And when you look at the amount of Black and Indigenous people in jail, you can see that the discretion is not used as often as it is in terms of other races. So for my second point, I want to talk about while youth or adults are involved in the justice system. So I believe, and it is shown, that the system does not take situations of family into consideration at all stages. Being involved in the justice system breaks up families. For example, when you have a court date, the court date is made when it's available for the court. If you're a single mother and you have a job, they're not asking you, hey, ma'am, what's your day off? They're just going to make that date. You have to miss that, day of work. You might have other children and you might not be able to show up. And because of that, that breaks up the family. Your child might feel like you're not there for them when really you're trying your best to be there for them. But it's very difficult because you have to provide for your other children. Some people are put in courts and justice systems that are very, very, very far away. Lindsay, Thunder Bay, they might live in Toronto, they might not drive. This makes it very difficult for family, for their children, for their loved ones to visit them. That breaks the family away. While they're in jail, that can cause depression, anxiety, trauma. They can experience violence, isolation, stress. And it doesn't seem as if it's a rehabilitation perspective in regards to keeping them with their family, because their family is their support system. And if somebody has a stronger family, that's going to allow them to rehabilitate into society a lot better. It makes it difficult for families to be involved with the incarcerated family member because it causes broken ties. So those broken ties are not understanding, maybe the person who is incarcerated not understanding that they're trying the best that they can. There might be some family members that don't want to be involved, but majority of them do. And if they have to miss their job, if they have to, miss interviews and miss so many things that they need to be involved in to come, because you don't just go to one court date, they're remanded to at least 10 before it's done. The person in jail might not understand because they're in such a traumatic situation, but the family's trying to be there. There's just all these obstacles that are keeping them away from being there. So especially when it comes to racialized families, that's a very big thing. More Indigenous children are in the child welfare foster care system right now than they were in residential schools, right? So that's a very big statistic. More than half of the Children's Aid Society in Ontario says that white children were underrepresented at 56% of agencies. So often that says that the social workers are not trained in cultural knowledge and sensitivity, and that is a lack of information not told to them. And there actually is a large amount of lack of information when it comes to what is neglect versus poverty. So, for example, at a community center I was in, there was a mother who was receiving food from the food bank, and she was getting a lot of peanut butter, and she had 5 kids and she's making them peanut butter sandwiches because that's what she could do. And the school's throwing out the peanut butter sandwiches because you're not allowed to have peanut butter in schools. It can cause an allergic reaction to other children, but she's doing what she can do. But at the same time, CS is called to her because her kids aren't having quote unquote inadequate lunches, but she's trying the best that she can. You know what I'm saying? So in terms of that, it correlates in the fact that there's not enough understanding with racialized communities, especially when you mix it in with the low income aspect of it. I also want to explain an example when it comes to the broken families part. like the breaking up of the families. I had a brother who was incarcerated in Lindsay for a while, and I went to visit him. I don't know how I got there. I took the GO bus. I took so many ways of getting there. Finally got there. I was 7 minutes late. I was told, hey, you can't see him. I was like, I'm only 7 minutes late. Like, I traveled so far. Like, I came from Scarborough. I wasn't driving. I don't even know how I found my way there. And there was no way I could see him. And that broke a bond. We didn't talk for a whole year because of that, because he's like, why didn't you get there on time? Why didn't you leave earlier? But I did the best that I could. So things like that happen where the family really is trying, but the bond is broken because it's hard to, I'm not saying that they're all not understanding, but put yourself in a situation where you're dealing with trauma and anxiety and you really want to see your family member. And when you can't see them, you know, it's difficult to understand the fact that they're really trying. And that breaks up the family more. So that's very difficult. And that for me is the second stage. So while they're involved in the justice system, I don't believe that they're given the proper support to reintegrate into society. So when it comes to the third point of reintegrating, like after they're out of jail and all of that, what people aren't really correlating is many youth who are involved in the youth justice system end up in the adult system. So before they even end up in jail for a very serious and federal prison for a serious charge, they kind of already been in the system a few times as a youth. So there was a lot of opportunities where they could have got the support that they needed, but because of the lack of the programming and the bias from the police, they never got that. So now they're in adult prison. When you're 18 in Canada, you can be charged as an adult, although you cannot purchase liquor or marijuana, cigarettes till you're 19. You can still be charged as an adult when you're 18 years old. And at that point, you're at a high risk state when you're released. You don't have opportunity for income. You don't have opportunity for like a lot of supports. Simply because the fact that you now have a record, even a simple job like McDonald's or Walmart, they do criminal record checks. And if you have a criminal record, you're not getting a job there. There is a very large lack of support when it comes to jobs for people who come out of prison. And it's horrible and it really needs to change. So after that, I want to talk about the risks. So right now, there are 14 communities that are listed as high risk in Toronto. They actually have like police constables assigned to them. And all 14 of those communities are racialized and low income communities. And it's very difficult to say that those are the high risk communities if you aren't basing the full data of Toronto. If you are not looking at every single community in Toronto, you cannot say that crime does not exist there. Crime exists everywhere in white communities, Black communities, every community. But if you only look at the Black communities, you're only going to see the crime there. So if they raid an area, for example, like Rosedale, there might be things found in Rosedale. But because it's an affluent area, they're not raided. So you know, they don't have to deal with the same type of problems that someone that lived in a low income racialized area would have to deal with. So for example, when youth are coming out and they're coming back to these areas that are heavily patrolled by police with their bikes and all that sort of stuff, they're at more risk to be either caught by the police or even just look suspicious or look like somebody who committed a crime and end up back into the system right where they came from, because it's kind of like they're being targeted if the police are solely, you know, focusing on these neighborhoods rather than looking at why the crimes are happening and just trying to, you know, be punitive about it and arrest them. There needs to be another way in looking at it in a different lens. So when you look at the justice system, if you're a Black man and you're coming back to the community and an Indigenous man, you have a very high chance of being carded. So there was a system carding. They have now stopped doing it in Toronto, but they would just stop. They could ask anybody for their ID. They would write their name on a card, and you are now carded. Your information is in the system. And it shows that they were more likely to do this to Black and Indigenous people, especially men. And that's very biased, very racist. And it still happens today. For example, I know a friend, when he drives in certain areas, he has to take off his hat. He has to not play certain type of music. He has to make sure that he's dressed a certain way, because the chances of him getting pulled over are way higher in certain areas where police are heavily patrolled based on his race and based on what he's, wearing. That's a reality. For a lot of these people who come out of jail, they have to wait a long time. Me personally, I had to wait over a year to get mental health support. A lot of people have to wait a long time to get mental health support, and that's really difficult when you're dealing with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and all of that on top of that, and you just came out of jail, you don't have a job, you're already looked down upon because of your race. You have all of that swarming in your life. And that's the main thing that a lot of other races need to really realize, that the things that Black and Indigenous people have to worry about are a lot different than other races. And it's a burden. It can cause severe anxiety in your life, unfortunately. So those are the 3 stages: before, while you're in, and after you get out. And that really ties into race and mental health. Very, very huge. So many people diagnosed with mental health, their lives are ended in altercations with the police. And a lot of these situations, their life did not need to end. Life is very precious. And I believe that a lot of the times where these lives were taken, there could have been a lot of other measures done rather than what was done. So a very important statistic is only 1% of 3,800 complaints against police officers in the last 5 years that went to the Independent Police Director Review ended up in disciplinary action. That's according to CBC. So that's only 1% of almost 4,000 complaints got a disciplinary action. So that's showing that, when lives are, taken away, that there's not really any sensitivity training or, charges laid against these police officers or disciplinary actions at all. And when you set up a system like that, not saying all police are bad, but if they know in the back of their head that they're not going to get charged, it makes it a little easier for them to not be cautious when they're, involving themselves with racialized people. So there's 3 examples that really touched me that I want to talk about. The first is Sammy Ateem. In 2013, he was an 18-year-old male who was on the streetcar with a knife. He told everyone to get off the streetcar, but he did not physically harm anybody at all. He did have a knife, but he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and police came and shot him 8 times. There was no reason to shoot him 8 times. I mean, he did not physically harm anybody. There could have been a lot of other things done: tear gas, tasers, things done to calm down the situation. At the end of the day, his life was lost. He was only 18 years old, and he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. The second person I want to talk about is Andrew Loku. He was a Black man. I believe he was Sudanese, African. He also was in Africa while there was a large civil war for about 10 years. So he had severe post-traumatic disorder. He was actually living in a building for people who have struggles with mental health and trauma, in a special building for that. And I don't know if the police were aware of that, but he was. He was walking around with a hammer. Again, he didn't harm anyone. Yes, he had a hammer, but the police shot him twice. I believe that there should have been way other things done before he was shot. Police wear protective gear. He didn't physically hit the police. He did have it in his hand, but again, this is another incident where it's correlating race and mental health and the life being lost. Another life that was very, very recent is Regis Korchinski, where, you know, the police were called for mental health crisis, were unaware of exactly what happened because all the police were cleared. But at the same time, it is believed that if there was a crisis team or, you know, a support, that the outcome could have been different. It's very intimidating for 4 to 5 officers to enter to talk to one person before she ended up falling. Some people believe she was pushed. Some people believe she was, you know, restrained and fell over. Honestly, we will never know, but the reality is there is a lot of other things that could have happened, you know, for her life to be, you know, spared, and her life was lost, and there was no responsibility towards the police for all 3 of these cases. So for my final point, I would like to talk about the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement versus the All Lives Matter. So I believe, it is strongly believed that All Lives Matter takes away from the Black Lives Matter movement. So when we say Black Lives Matter, we're not saying they matter more. We are saying that Black lives are just as important, right? So when one community has been given more advantages than another community, how can you say that they're equal? They don't all of a sudden have the same equal opportunity. You are now negating the disadvantaged community and denying them access and the same human rights as other communities. Black Lives Matter was created when Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old Black male, was murdered by George Zimmerman for quote unquote looking suspicious, and George Zimmerman was found not guilty. So in a perfect society, we shouldn't even have to say Black Lives Matter, because the Black Lives Matter movement was started because of the deaths of Black lives from police, Black lives dying from police, and the discrimination. There are many names attached to the Black Lives Matter movement, such as Oscar Grant, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Eric Gardner, and most recently, George Floyd, which has sparked protests all over the world. Black Lives Matter, it only exists because Black lives are being taken by the police disproportionately compared to white lives. And it's happening as recently as this year. And we need to ask ourselves, if it was a white man saying, "I can't breathe," would that officer have gotten up and lifted his knee from the neck of George Floyd if he was white? And most of these cases where the person who died was Black or Indigenous, they were unarmed. All the names, Trayvon, Tamir, all those names that I named, they were all unarmed, and yet their lives were all taken away. And it ends up being a loss of life, even if it's not a violent case, you know, and it's a mental health crisis some of the times. So saying all lives matter is disrespectful to the Black community, because we say Black Lives Matter, not because we think our lives are more important, because we're saying that our lives should be as important as white lives and as other people's lives. And I think I'm good. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you very much for that powerful message. So I have some questions for the panelists, for the speakers, and then we'll open it up to the Q&A. We'll start with the Q&A that's already been logged. But I have, I wanted to say to Orville, first of all, that your phrase, I hadn't heard it before, and I really liked it. When you were talking about defunding the police, and you said detask the police. I don't know if that's your phrase, but I think it's an excellent phrase because it describes what you mean, right? You're not saying take all the money away from all the police so we don't even have, I mean, some people might want that, but I don't think most people are saying that. most people are saying, take away the things that they don't do well and give it to people that do. So I really like that phrase. I'm going to start using that. Thank you for that. I also wanted to ask Teddy, this is a question that came to us. We had some questions come to us ahead of time before tonight from some of the people registered in the Only Way Forward project. And this one, Teddy, I think anybody can answer it, but maybe you could start. It's the one about, what's your opinion about what's going on in Nova Scotia with the lobster fishery? What would you say about that?
Well, I think with what's happening out in Nova Scotia, again, it goes back to what those treaty rights say for the Mi'kmaq people out in Nova Scotia. Again, some of those treaties are longer than Canada has ever been a nation. So it's really looking at like what's the availability, and I think like the big conversation is like, what is that, like the moderate livelihood that those Mi'kmaq fisheries would take in, and looking how minimal those numbers were compared to like the commercial fishery that takes place there throughout their fishing that fishing season compared to the Mi'kmaq rights of whatever livelihood that can be. So I feel like if the treaty says that they can fish, and if that is your ancestry, and if you can, then that should be your treaty right. So same thing with like, even my own treaty right here in Ontario in Bawating. It gives me the treaty right if I wanted to fish outside of the fishing season or hunt outside of the hunting season. But again, it's when it comes to those aspects of like fishing and hunting, it goes back to like how we fished or how we hunted before, and like how it was done in a good way. And a lot of its time it was just taking what you needed, understand, and like making sure that there was enough preserved for the next generation ahead. So I think and again, so it goes back to like how much is that impacting like lobster populations if it's overfishing with commercial fishing compared to a couple of boats and some nets. So what's really more problematic there. But what's scary though is the reaction of like the RCMP in the Nova Scotia, where folks weren't too sure of like where the spokesperson said, we understand both sides, but we don't think it's a policing issue, when they had property that was set on fire and people's lives that were being threatened and people's property that was being damaged. Indigenous lives and Indigenous property, and the RCMP saying like, we understand both sides. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? And like understanding that the RCMP was created in a way to police Indigenous people historically, but now seen as some of the only policing services available in some communities. So it's very complex what's happening in Nova Scotia, but the history of policing Indigenous people is also very complex.
So can I just want to ask you, I'd like to expand this a little more, because there was an injunction on October 21st, and it was issued from the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia, and it said that the non-Indigenous commercial fisheries have used, and I quote, criminal intimidation, threats, and property destruction to try to prevent the Mi'kmaq fishery from carrying out their treaty rights. So my question is, and it's for you, and it's also for Yas and for Orville, when we talk about excessive force, when we're talking about people dying by excessive force, we're talking about non-Indigenous fishermen, men in commercial fisheries, torching the Indigenous fishery and using intimidation, becoming violent. What do you think should be the response of the government, of law enforcement to that?
So I can just say something. So there definitely needs to be some sort of like that should be a charge, because when you look at it, even in the history, there's a long history of that. Like I believe it was in Nova Scotia also, where Africanville, I don't think that's a good term to say, was created where, you know, Black people who were slaves created their own community.
Yes.
And yes, and they were thriving. They were doing amazing. They were catching so much fish because they learned all these things in Africa, and they knew how to build things in ways that, you know, the others didn't know because they had all these trades from Africa, and they didn't like that, so they burnt it down. And whatever was remained, they sold it and gave it to, you know, white people. And there's many Black communities like Greenwood, the Tulsa Race Massacre. There's a lot of different communities. I think there's another one called Springfield. There's a lot of communities where there was like a Black Wall Street, where Black, you know, people were creating these things, because a lot of the terms that people will say, oh, well, you know, racialized people just take what we give them. Like, they don't build their own stuff. They just came to Canada and, you know, they take the government assistance or whatever, you know, the things that people will say. But the reality is there's a lot of communities where Indigenous and Black built their own stuff and said, hey, okay, you don't want to let us in? Let's build our own communities. Let's build our own stuff. And those communities were actually torched down or sold. And there was no repercussions to those people. And people are affected, and that's generational abuse. So I see that in the Black community also, where the ancestors of all those people probably suffered years later and didn't even know they were connected to those people.
So Orville, like, I'm going to ask you the same question.
Yeah,
What do you think should happen?
So, a couple of things. I think when the notion of the Mi'kmaq fishery I have to bring it back to, again, why I framed my presentation by looking at the legacies as colonialism. It plays a huge role here. So the lack of action by the Canadian government to define what is considered a moderate livelihood is another example of, you know, colonial refusal to act on treaty rights even after the courts have upheld their legitimacy. So there's three things I would say that need to happen is, you know, immediately. So the violence against the Mi'kmaq fisheries and their property needs to end, number one. Number two, the representatives from all sides of the issue also need to sit down and discuss how best to proceed. Number three, the federal government needs to sit down with the First Nation leadership to discuss how to define concepts like moderate livelihood, conversation as it relates to Indigenous governance of fishery stocks. So this all goes back to like the sad reality of where do we end up? Where do we end with this? And this is the sad reality that Indigenous people in Canada are still poorly served by the Canadian government, and this is a one of the legacies that we've been having to deal with, and Indigenous people specifically have been having to deal with for the past 400 plus years. So yeah, those are a couple of things I think need to happen.
So Orville, there's a question for you here. And the question is, you mentioned that when youth feel hopeless, they're unable to make decisions. What have you seen that gives you hope? Have you seen youth's lives transform when they have hope? If they have transformed, what factors were important in helping them to transform? It's a big question.
So I mean, yeah, there's definitely been success stories, and requires to really look at, you know, a case by case situation. But I would say some key factors need to be in place, and it's definitely working with youth from a strength based perspective, looking at positive youth development, engaging them with an adult ally that can be a person that says to that person, to that young person that will nurture them and will tell them that they believe in them, and will empower them to really look at their assets and empower young people to do what's best. So what we're seeing now is a breakdown of not only the nuclear family but families in general, whereas many kids are stuck to their own device on their own, and now without that support from a healthy an adult ally who's invested in their change and for the better and for their success, what we're seeing is young people out going out to the streets, and the streets are raising these young kids. So the streets are in essence now becoming the family members to many of these young kids, and then there's that cycle of gang involvement, drug use, you know, and it starts there, but it can go into heavier things like trafficking, and we want to really look at, you know, how do we look at the unit that begins at just having these conversations with young people at our own dinner tables before we even bring them outside of our homes. It starts within those areas. But the factors are looking at creating opportunities, getting them into employment opportunities, looking at ways to work with them from an anti-oppressive framework. So don't speak at them, speak to them, engage them at decision-making tables, bring their voices to spaces where they feel involved. Young people are experts, and really just speaking to them in that way is important, because they form a voice that shouldn't be shut down. And many in Caribbean cultures, we've been trained to, you know, quiet down our kids, and that voice is oftentimes not it doesn't have an opportunity to grow and blossom into a fruit. So I think it's really important that we plant them and grow them with nurture and support.
Thanks, Orville. I'd like to ask a hope question to Teddy and Yas too. How hopeful are you that real change is possible?
So I'll just go because I believe I'm a story of change. Like I said, I have been involved in the justice system. I also was in the foster care system. And I am now taking my degree for child and youth care to help kids that were just like me. And I had CUICs and social workers that believed in me, and that's the reason I'm here today. You have to separate the file from the individual. So if you read my file right now and you see me, you might not be as open to talk to me because anything can be written on your file. You can't judge kids for what they did in the worst situations of their life. You have to look at the strength of what they did. So if they're stealing cars, maybe they can be a mechanic. Look at the strength in what they did. If they're, hustling in these streets and selling, maybe they're good at math. It takes a lot of good skills to do some of these things that are looked at as negative. There's actually positives in it. And I believe that a lot of youth workers, because they're looking at
Something went funny with your sound.
Can you hear me now?
Try again.
Hello?
Okay, well, did you go onto speaker maybe by accident on your phone? No,
I didn't touch anything.
All right, keep going.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I can touch the speaker. I don't know.
That's better.
Okay, whatever that, yeah, that's much better.
So I believe working, as Orville stated, in an anti-oppressive way, speaking to, not acting as if you know everything, because they're experts. You've been through it, what it's, the situations, you navigate through it every single day, and you're dealing with these traumas. And to be looked down upon is not something that you need. I believe there's hope. When I was younger, I was told that, to just do a trade, I wouldn't be able to, go to university. It's the truth. I was told that by the education system because I do have a learning disability, and I'm Black, and all the things against me were there. But I persevered. I'm 28 years old now. I have a child, she's 5, and I'm still doing what I need to do despite things that were written in my file. So I definitely believe there's hope. And I told myself, if I can just help one like me, because y'all don't know, I had an attitude back then. I'm really polite now, but I had people who believed in me. I've seen people that said, hey, you have an attitude, you can talk back. Maybe you can help someone else, seeing the positivity in me. And if I can help one, just one, which I hope to help more,
I think
that will literally warm my heart, because I believe that sometimes we go through things so that we can help other people. We use our experiences to help other people. We've been there, we went through that. And I think there's definitely always hope, even in the youth that you look at as, you know, quote unquote hopeless. I don't care what your charge is. There's always hope. There's always, you know, a better light. And I'm very thankful, you know, for the people who believed in me. Nancy's one of them, because there's times where I wanted to give up. I'll be real with you. There's times where I wanted to give up. You know, it was hard. When I started school, my child was 1 year old, and it was difficult. It was difficult, but I pushed through. So I'm proud of all the youth that pushed through. Orville has been on my email contact for 12 years, sending me jobs. There's a couple of jobs that I even got thanks to him. So I'm gonna thank him too, even though we never met before today, because there's people out there that really care, and those people that dedicate their lives are gonna change kids like me. So not even change, just give them the hope that they need. So
thank you, yes.
Thanks. Shout out to all those people.
Shout out to you too. Teddy, what about you? What would you say about hope? Oh, you're on mute.
I think when it comes for me, hope is a very finicky thing to say. And I also want to make sure that it's not a buzzword too, because I think when it comes to hope, I think about accountability, and it's not just like allyship. I don't want folks to be allies for Indigenous people. It's like I want folks to be accountable for their own understanding of colonization and the impacts it has on Indigenous people and racialized people to begin with. So, and for me, like I'm also I've done some work with Aboriginal Legal Services in Toronto, and so I was able to gain an understanding about GLADU reporting. So if there's an Indigenous person that's a part of the legal system, and if they do identify as Indigenous, and if they have a history of it, like some of those like colonial trauma that has impacted them, then that can also be a part of their included in part of like their sentencing. I think there's also different restorative justice models where bringing either the victim and the abuser together and finding a solution within the community and holding that person accountable to what those actions will be moving forward in that good way. So there are different initiatives now happening in Canada. Again, it's a very different scene here than it was maybe 15 years ago, or even like even 20 years ago, because I'm 34 now, and seeing what the relationship with Indigenous people can be with other folks. Again, when I started doing workshops about 10 years ago and having a lot of people saying like, I don't know about Indigenous people, I don't know what it means to be First Nation. Maybe I heard about what I heard about residential schools, but that's all that I know. Compared to now having different conversations, and like even younger folk, high school students, and them having conversations about residential schools and the 60s scoop and reservations and water rights and I don't know more and different movements. So those movements are starting to impact different generations now. I think we have the aspect of social media that definitely helps us along the way. But I think when it understands if we're keeping in mind of being hopeful, we also have to understand that we have to use our privilege to make sure that hope can be given to other people. Because even having this conversation right now, just like on Zoom, having access to Wi-Fi, having access to laptops, having access to smartphones, having access to employment or money so we can pay our bills and have electricity to do all this thing, paying for childcare, paying for someone. I had somebody
drinking water, right?
Right, exactly. And sometimes those things that we take for granted, because the other thing that we have when we start having these conversations about inclusion, or we start having conversations about policing or conversations about colonialism, my conversation is like, okay, who's in the room, but who isn't in the room? Who needs to be a part of that conversation? How do we need to change our language to make sure that they can still access what we're trying to get to them, and that we can access to where they are? And as social workers, that's the one thing that we learn is like, how do we meet people where they're at? And I think that's the best thing that we need to move forward. And sometimes it's getting over what we think we know or what we don't know about being Indigenous, or what we need about being inclusive or being racist. Because that's the other thing too, when I do workshops, is the one thing I was asking for years is like, what does an LGBTQ person look like? They could look like anybody on this panel. What does an Indigenous person look like? They can also look like anybody on this panel. The conversations the questions I was not asking when it involved my own safety though, and the safety of other LGBTQ First Nations people in that room. What does a racist person look like? What does a homophobic person look like? Or what does a transphobic person look like? Because they can also look like anybody on this panel. So we ask the people of the language that we use, the behavior that we have, and the behavior of others, and the language that others use around us, because we don't know who is Indigenous or LGBTQ or comes from a racialized background, because we're not all the same. So, and I think we're looking at some Indigenous models when it comes to restorative justice, when it comes to inclusive methods to bringing community together in a holistic way, and trying to and looking at healing and not incarceration, and looking at what are those root items. It's like, why is that person behaving this way? And not saying like that person's behaving that way because they're Indigenous. And it's poisonous because like and it's very systemic, because it's not just policing system, it's also happening in the medical care system, because we had the one woman, the young woman by the name of Joyce in Quebec, who just passed away in the emergency room, and like recording aspects of racism with the nurses with that, and looking at a case like from like even 12 years ago in Winnipeg, of a gentleman, an Indigenous person, who died in the waiting room in the ER.
I remember that.
So it still happens. So and that's the other thing. And I really appreciate the names that Yas had mentioned, and the names that was presented earlier in the conversation, because those are the names that we know of. But how many of those names are those stories that we don't hear? And they're probably still a lot, because those aspects of discrimination in policing in Indigenous people, aspects of discrimination in policing in racialized folks still happens today. I'm in Sault Ste. Marie, I'm in a smaller community, and so those communities, and so those conversations can still happen, but sometimes they're not always reported on, or sometimes not always brought to light until something else later on happens. And so I was like, hey, no, that this happened to me. And they're like, okay, well, why didn't you say anything? Well, maybe because it's normalized, or maybe because they were afraid of their own safety if they did come forward and say anything. So there's a lot of things we have to.
Complicated, yeah.
So I do have a little bit of hope, because if I didn't, then I wouldn't be doing this work.
Thank you, Teddy. I'm very aware. It's fascinating, actually, all of you. Thank you so much. I'm aware that we have a list of questions. I'm going to go through them, but here they're open. My plea to Teddy and Yaz and Orville is, I guess, we'll go through them, and maybe what we'll do is just one person, we could rotate, or you guys can decide which one wants to take it, and just have one person answer, because I'm aware of the time, but I do want to get to the questions. So I'm going to go with the one I think was first, and it's from Joy Morris, who is actually on our Quakers Fostering Justice Committee. She's one of my bosses, actually. I'm glad that she's here tonight. Her question is for Orville, and it says, Orville, you mentioned race-based data and the need for such disaggregated data. Whoops. Would you comment on the issue of distinction for some people between self-identified race and the extent to which someone might be visually identified as belonging to a particular race? How does this affect the ways in which people may feel racism?
So that's a great question, and I think it's a real reality in terms of a sad reality in terms of what happens in terms of the experience of racism. So what we're seeing in communities and across the world and across the country is that there's a assumption or a stereotype associated with the way someone looks, and it's not always, you know, the reality of what their culture is, their identity is, and then their experience. So I think it's our own. So change starts within ourselves, and I think ourselves, we need to really look at, you know, our own biases, our own unconscious biases, and are inherited within the fabric of society through structural racism, and really question why, you know, we think certain ways, why we're assuming certain things, and look at it from a lens of equity and inclusion. When I say equity, is really looking at people for getting to know the book before you read the cover, if I could say that, and getting to really understand their true identities and their experiences. I've seen it happen in communities in within the justice system within Toronto, for example, of a young Black man who's really from Africa, but the media says, well, this is a young Jamaican guy and he's associated, he has a gun, and it really it contributes further to the racial trauma, the level of stigmatism and the public health crisis that these young men are going through, and it's important to really acknowledge that that's something that's negatively impacting their well-being. So I'll leave it there. I could go on longer, but I recognize time.
It's so complex. I just like to add that that bleeds, what you just said bleeds into the LGBTQ community as well. And I'm thinking in particular, and Teddy referenced it earlier, on October 26th, a 30-year-old trans woman was died here as probably a result of excessive force by police. And one of the things that happened in the course of that was she was misgendered by the police and by the initial reports, and reported as a man. And that's also a very typical thing that happens a lot to trans and queer youth here in Toronto, and adults too. And I came across that quite a bit working in the justice system. And I was talking to a reporter about it yesterday, actually, and she's actually taken it on as an issue and hopefully is going to follow it up with some action and some more articles to raise awareness about that. So I'm looking also at Lauren, at your question, and I think, so the question is really about knowing the way the justice system is currently set up. What would you say are the most important factors working or things that our support workers can do to be most effective in supporting Black, Indigenous, people of color youth, BIPOC youth, to navigate the current and oppressive racialized system? I'm thinking that Orville, when you spoke a little bit about, you answered the question about hope before, and I think what can be done, I think you outlined it quite well in terms of what can be done. I don't know, Lauren, if you wanted more answer to that question. I know it is a big question. Do you want to type into chat if you're still here, Lauren, and tell me if that's okay for now, or did you want Yas maybe to say more about that, because you have her name in here? I don't know if Lauren's even still here. Do you know, Kira? No. Oh, here she is. No, thank you. Ah, okay. Yes, you answered. Thank you, Lauren. Okay, great. So I'm going to move on. Again, Joy has a question for Yas, and she says, thank you, Yas, for your powerful stories of lived experience. I've heard that in big United States city school funding is equalized to some extent by a formula that takes a percentage of parent fundraising from all schools and redistributes it to the schools that are less able to fundraise. What do you think of that idea?
Thank you, Joy, for that. I didn't even know that. I think that's a great idea. I think having schools equalize the funding that is raised makes it a fair playing ground for everybody. If they're all public schools, they should all receive the same funding. Why are some public schools more funded by private boosters and corporations? And
yes, your voice is doing that thing again.
Let me try.
You're back. Okay.
Better?
Yep.
Better?
Yes.
Okay, but I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I couldn't hear you. Sorry.
Oh,
yeah. So equalizing it sounds great. You know, for example, if you're a parent that owns a big company, you can get the jerseys donated, you can get snacks, you can get food, you can, you know, you can get your company to sponsor the school, and making it so that it's an equal playing field. I think it's amazing. It touches on what Orville was saying on the literacy. We have to think of what type of education these youth were getting before they even entered the system, if that even allowed them to have any sense of understanding of the justice system at all, if they were able to read at a level that they were supposed to, if they were given the special ed support, if they do need that. So I really like that idea. I think that would be amazing. It just makes it more fair.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
I'm looking at Bryden Gombe's question now, and excuse me, Bryden writes, I'm wondering, in this context of racism, brown people from, say, Pakistan or Sri Lanka, how do they fare?
So I'll just say something a little on that, because for me, so my family is Ethiopian and Somalian background, from Africa. My name, Yasmin Ibrahim, is a Middle Eastern name. There is Middle Eastern in my DNA just because of colonization and all of that. And also, when people see my name, they assume that I'm a Middle Eastern person just because my name is an Arabic name. I do believe that racialized, like when I say racialized, I do equate them all. The older gentleman that died, sorry, I can't remember his name, by the police. He was, I believe, East Indian or Pakistani. He was also
South Asian, yeah.
South Asian. Sami Yatim that I mentioned was Arabic. So I'm not only saying that it, when I say racialized, like once you have a little bit of color in your skin and you're from different cultures, it happens also. So I really, some of the cases that I mentioned weren't only just of Black and Caribbean. It also happens to Brown, Middle Eastern people also, because it happens, unfortunately.
I'll tell you, when I was doing the Roy McMurtry Youth Center review, that's the youth super jail in Brampton, Ontario, just outside of Toronto. There were many young men there incarcerated that were brown-skinned, and they fared very, very poorly in terms of any understanding of culture, some of the religious expectations and customs that they had that they wanted to continue to follow. Some of the, I'm even thinking of other populations during Ramadan and fasting and how that was not respected. So I think what you just said, yes, anybody with a little bit of color that's not white and from the settler culture fares very, very poorly. So I think that was a really good question from Braden. Kira, you just sent me something. Are you trying to tell me that it's 9 o'clock, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
I can read your mind now. Well, we still have questions, and they're big questions. I think, what do the panelists feel? I feel like, oh, somebody's got something here about the audience. Oh, audible minorities. Yes, there's a question about audible minorities. Gosh, this is monolithic. That's a comment from Susan. It's 9 o'clock. We've been here since before 7. How about I don't know if the panel would agree to this, to answering the questions via email to the ones that we haven't had a chance to answer? Would people, yeah, Teddy, you think that's a good idea? If we could do that, and I'm not going to promise a date, sometime over the next, let's say, 1 to 2 weeks, because Kiro, you'll have access to all the email addresses.
Yes, if you've registered for this, I have your email address, so I can send it all out.
And I think maybe that's the best way to handle it. I'm getting some private messages from some people that some people are fading, and I'm not as robust as I was a few hours ago either. So I'd really like to thank Yasmin, Teddy, and Orville. Heartfelt thanks to you for your insightful presentations tonight. Your knowledge and shared experience have deepened my understanding greatly, and there's still so much work to do. I'm glad that you each in your own way said that you had hope, that there was hope, but you all also each in your own way outlined for me just how complex and layered the issues are and how much work there still is to do. Maybe that's why I'm not feeling as robust as I was feeling at the beginning. I'm half joking, but not really. Thank you so much for taking the time with us. Our next panel actually is next week, next Thursday night at 7. Same time. It'll be a different link that Kira will send out, and it's about alternatives to a punitive justice system. And we actually have Rick Kelly from the Just Us Restorative Justice Organization that he helped found. We have a representative from Cahoots, and that's the alternative program from Eugene, Oregon, the mental health crisis team that was set up from some funds from the police being siphoned off into that. And then we have Judy Cameron, who is an Indigenous community development worker and works also in the child welfare realm from Thunder Bay, and also a member of our advisory group. So that's next week. I hope that you will come back for that. And I'm so grateful that everyone came tonight. Kira, you have a few things to add?
Yeah, just super quickly. First of all, thank you for taking this technological journey with me. What I'm looking for is just some feedback on this panel so that we can improve the next 2 panels that are coming up. So I'm posting a link in the chat, and if you have a moment, it'll take you less than 2 minutes. We would really appreciate it if you could have a look at that. And I'm also going to post another link to our website, and there's more information on the work that CFSC does there, and also some information on how to donate. And we are a charity that relies on individual donations. So if it's something you're able to do, we would really appreciate that. And it helps us do more things like this. But thank you so much to the panel for coming. Really enjoyed it, and I got a lot out of it. So thank you so much. And thank you to the attendees for joining.
Yes, thank you to everyone for joining and for showing your openness to hear new and different perspectives. And I hope we'll continue this journey together. And Teddy, Yaz, and Orville, again, so honored that you joined us tonight.